if one day the father who once taught you how to tie your shoelaces put his pen to paper and signed your name in exchange for an old truck, what would you believe in anymore? And if the man who took you away from that place did not see you as merchandise, but as a human being standing on the edge, could life turn in a completely different direction? This is not just a story about betrayal. It is a story about the actual value of a person, a value that does not lie in someone else's signature, but in the way you are loved. Stay until the end, because what happens next may make you look back at your own life. The summer of 2004, a small town in the American Midwest, where every road leads back to open fields and every story ends at the only bar on Main Street. That night, the neon light behind the bar flickered like a weak heartbeat. Gravel crunched underfoot as people walked past. No one paid attention to the parking lot in the back, where agreements that should never exist were signed in silence. Dale Jensen stood there, holding a can of beer gone warm. His shirt was wrinkled, the collar stained yellow from sweat and time. He was not the worst man in town, but he was the kind of man who chose the most straightforward path whenever he had to face hardship. Across from him stood Caleb Turner, 38 years old, a widower, owner of a dairy farm nearly an hour's drive away. Caleb was not a man of many words. His face bore the cracks carved by sun and prairie wind. His gray eyes were steady and deep, as if they had grown accustomed to endurance rather than complaint. Between them sat an old Ford F-150. The paint had faded. The truck bed was scratched, but the engine still ran strong. Dale placed his hand on the hood as though it were a treasure. "The girl can work," he said, his voice heavy with the smell of alcohol. "She cooks, keeps house, doesn't cause trouble." Caleb did not respond immediately. He did not look at the truck. He looked toward the back door of the bar. There, Mark Jensen, 21 years old, stood leaning against the brick wall, arms crossed over her chest. She wore a gray hoodie, her hair tied low. The defiance had faded from her eyes, but so had the innocence. It was the look of someone who had learned to stay silent to survive. She could not hear the conversation clearly. She only saw her father pull a stack of crumpled papers from his pocket. The sound of pen against paper was louder than the cars passing on the street. The signature was placed down quickly, no hesitation, no second glance. Dale handed the truck keys to Caleb, and in the same breath he turned to his daughter. "Go pack your things." Just 4 words. No explanation, no apology. Mark did not question him. She knew that look, knew that tone. Asking would only make things worse. She walked back to the small house at the end of the street where the smell of dampness and the television playing all day had become familiar. She gathered a few changes of clothes, an old notebook, and the necklace her mother had left behind before she passed away. She did not cry. Not because it didn't hurt, but because tears no longer changed anything. Meanwhile, Caleb remained standing beside the truck. He held the keys, but his hand did not tighten around them. He understood exactly what had just happened. This was not a legal contract, not an arranged marriage, and certainly not kindness. This was desperation, wrapped in the shape of a transaction. And he knew, if he turned his back and walked away, another man would not hesitate the way he did. When Mark returned to the parking lot with a canvas bag slung over her shoulder, the neon light cast her shadow long across the cracked concrete. She stopped in front of Caleb. She did not look at her father. "Are we going?" she asked, her voice flat, as if speaking about catching a bus. Caleb gave a slight nod. But before opening the truck door, he said one sentence, quiet enough that only she could hear. "You don't owe me anything." Mark paused slightly. Perhaps it was the first kind sentence she had heard in years. Caleb's old Silverado pulled out of the parking lot, leaving behind the loud music and flickering lights. Dale Jensen climbed into the newly acquired F-150. He started the engine, smiling to himself, unaware that he had just lost the most precious thing in his life. Inside the worn cabin of the truck heading north, Mark stared out the window. Fields stretched endlessly. The sky darkened. Stars shimmered as if unaware that an exchange had just taken place beneath neon lights. She did not know what awaited her ahead, a new life or another version of the same prison. Caleb kept his hand steady on the steering wheel. He did not speak much, but within him there was a clear decision. He had not bought her. He had taken her away from a place that treated her like merchandise. And sometimes, a single decision like that, it is enough to change the course of many lives. The truck continued rolling through the night, and up ahead, a house waited to be lit again, though neither of the two people inside the vehicle knew it yet. The road leading to the Turner farm was long and empty. On both sides, cornfields stretched to the horizon, the leaves brushing softly against one another in the night wind like whispers without meaning. The old Silverado rolled steadily forward, its headlights slicing through the darkness. Mark sat in the passenger seat, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She did not ask where they were going. She did not ask how long she would stay there. After tonight, questions no longer seemed to belong to her. Caleb drove in silence. From time to time, he glanced at the clock, then back at the road ahead. He did not know what to say to erase the distance between them. A distance not created by age, but by the circumstances that had just unfolded. Around midnight, they stopped at a small roadside gas station. The fluorescent lights cast a cold glow. Caleb stepped out of the truck, then turned back and handed Mark a motel room key from behind the station. "Go get some rest," he said, quietly. "I'll sleep in the truck." Mark looked at the key in her hand. She had stayed in places without locks, in rooms where the doors barely closed. She had grown used to sleeping with her eyes half open, but that night when she stepped into the small room with white sheets that still smelled of bleach, she locked the door from the inside. The click was soft, but clear, and no one tried to open it. She sat on the edge of the bed for a long time. No tears, no trembling, just steady breathing. For the first time in years, silence did not frighten her. The next morning, as they resumed their journey, the sun slowly rose over the wheat fields. Honey-colored light spread across the land, gentle and patient. The Turner farm appeared after a bend in the road, a white wooden house with patches of peeling paint, a slightly slanted porch, and a fence in need of repair. Not grand, not perfect, but standing. Caleb stopped the truck. He did not rush to open the door. "This is home," he said. Mark stepped out. The prairie wind brushed through her hair, carrying the scent of dry grass and damp soil. In the distance stood the barn, the faint clang of metal as chains shifted against one another. The front door opened before Caleb could call out. 3 boys stood there. Ethan, 14, tall and thin, eyes wary. Luke, 10, curious, head tilted in observation. Noah, 7, standing slightly behind his brothers, hands gripping the hem of his shirt. The house behind them was not messy, everything was in order, but the air felt hollow, like a place that had once been filled with laughter, then suddenly gone quiet. "This is Mark," Caleb said simply. "She'll be staying here for a while." Ethan crossed his arms. "We don't need help." Mark did not respond sharply. She simply looked straight at the boy. "Then we won't get in each other's way," she said gently. "No challenge, no weakness, just calm." That afternoon, Mark walked through the house. She did not rummage. did not change anything. She only observed. An old framed photograph on the wall, a blonde woman smiling brightly between three children. A rocking chair by the window, coated with a thin layer of dust. The kitchen is clean but lacks warmth. She opened the refrigerator and checked the ingredients. Then she began preparing dinner. No one asked her to. But the scent of sautéed onions and simmering meat filled the kitchen. Luke smelled it first. Noah edged closer. Ethan remained at a distance but did not leave the doorway. The meal began in silence. Caleb sat at the head of the table. Mark served the boys first. Noah took a bite, then looked up. "It's better than frozen food," he said softly. Luke let out a small giggle. Ethan said nothing, but he finished his portion. That evening, Noah carried a thin book toward Mark. "Can you read to me?" She looked at Caleb. He gave a slight nod. Mark sat down in the armchair, Noah leaning against the armrest. Luke sat on the floor. Ethan stood by the doorway, pretending not to care. Her voice was steady, not dramatic, not trying to impress. Just warm. When the story ended, Noah had fallen asleep. Luke rubbed his eyes. Ethan was still standing there, but his gaze was no longer as sharp as it had been that afternoon. Caleb watched from the hallway. The house had sound again. Not loud laughter, not noise. Just breathing. When night fell, Mark was shown to a small room at the end of the hall. The door had a lock. The window faced the fields. She set her bag down and sat on the bed. Outside, she heard Caleb checking the doors, the boy's footsteps running down the hallway. She realized something small, but essential. No one looked at her like merchandise. They looked at her like something not yet understood. And within that caution, there was room for hope. The Turner farm was not perfect. The walls still held cracks, the doors still creaked, but in the house that had once forgotten how to breathe that night, a new heartbeat began to form. And sometimes change does not arrive with thunder. It comes with the smell of dinner cooking on the stove, a story before bedtime, and a child who slowly stopped standing so far away. The weeks that followed did not pass according to the dates on a calendar, but through the small changes reflected in people's eyes. The Turner farm still woke at 5 in the morning. The alarm rang. Boots touched the wooden floor. The rich smell of coffee drifted from the kitchen. But now, before Caleb came down the stairs, 2 slices of toast, fried eggs, and a small handwritten note were already on the table. "Don't forget to call the livestock feed supplier. They overcharged by 8%. Caleb read the line, his brow tightening slightly. He opened his ledger and checked again. She was right. He said nothing. But that evening, as he sat across from Mark at the dinner table, he placed the accounting book down in front of her. "Take a look at this for me," he said. Not because he didn't know how, but because he was beginning to trust her. Meanwhile, the boys changed in their own ways. Noah no longer hid behind his brothers. He began sitting beside Mark while she peeled apples, telling her about his tangled dreams. Once he asked quietly, "Are you staying here for a long time?" Mark paused for a second. "What if you want me to?" she asked. Noah nodded eagerly, and she smiled. "Then I'll stay." Luke was different. He liked to ask questions about everything. Why does a premature calf need to be kept warm? Why do people have to borrow money from the bank? Why don't you have the Turner last name? The last question stilled the air. Mark did not avoid it. Because there are names people are born with, and there are names they have to earn. Luke did not fully understand, but he nodded as if he did. And Ethan. Ethan was the real test. At 14, he carried anger that had not yet found its name. He had lost his mother too early. He had watched his father endure in silence. And now, another woman had stepped into the house. He was not rude, but he kept his distance. Until one afternoon when Mark went out to the barn and saw a newborn calf trembling. The wind had shifted suddenly. Rain was rolling in. Caleb was out in the far fields. Ethan was in charge of the barn. "We need to get it inside," Mark said. "I've got it," Ethan replied quickly. But as they tried to pull the calf in, it slipped and fell into the wet mud. Mark did not stand back. She knelt, her clothes soaking in mud, her hands steadying the calf's head to keep it from panicking. She whispered something very softly, her voice even and firm. Ethan froze. No one had asked her to do that. No one was paying her to do it. But she did it anyway. Together, they dragged the calf into the barn. By the time the door shut, Ethan was breathing hard. "You didn't have to do that," he said, his voice less sharp than before. Mark wiped her hands on a towel. "Out here, if a life needs help, we help," she replied. No lecture, no reproach. Just that. That night, when Ethan sat down to write his English essay, the most influential person in your life, he stared at the blank page for a long time. Then he began to write. Not about his mother, but about someone who wasn't born into the family but chose to stay. A week later, something happened. A new seasonal worker laughed when he saw Mark balancing the books. "So, Mr. Turner bought himself a secretary too?" he sneered. No one laughed. Ethan heard it. The punch came fast and clean. Caleb arrived when it was already over. The worker stepped back, stammering an apology. Mark walked over to Ethan. Blood seeped across his knuckles. She did not scold him. She did not praise him. She took a cloth and wiped his hand. "Next time," she said quietly, "use words. They're sharper than fists." Ethan looked at her, not with defiance anymore, but with the look of someone learning how to protect what he values. That evening, as Caleb stood on the porch watching the kitchen lights spill into the yard, he realized something he had not dared to hope for before. This house was no longer just a place to sleep and eat. It had new sounds, new scents, a new rhythm, not loud, but alive. And deep down, Caleb understood. The most significant change was not in balanced accounts or a calf saved from the cold. It was this. His 3 boys were beginning to laugh again. And the woman who had once been handed over like merchandise was slowly filling the cracks he had never known how to mend. And Mark? She did not speak about the past, did not mention the night in the parking lot, did not mention the signature. She simply continued doing what needed to be done. Because sometimes, a person's worth does not lie in where they were taken, but in how they choose to stay. In small towns, people don't need newspapers to spread the news. All it takes is a glance that lingers a little too long, a casually dropped remark at the checkout counter, and by the end of the day, the whole town knows. On the first Sunday, they went together to Walmart in the neighboring town. The sky was clear and the wind was light. Mark wore a simple pale blue dress, her hair tied low at the nape of her neck. No makeup, no display. She only wanted to buy sugar, flour, and a few notebooks for Luke. But the moment they stepped into the first aisle, the silence began to form. Not the loud kind of silence, but the intentional kind. 2 women by the cereal section stopped talking. A man in the frozen foods aisle turned away a little too quickly. A soft cough filled the space. Mark was used to it. She felt those stares the way she felt cold wind brushing across her skin. Caleb pushed the cart slowly as if he didn't notice, but he did. At the checkout counter, the inevitable happened. A middle-aged woman with carefully curled hair stood behind them. She didn't speak loudly, just enough for those nearby to hear. "I heard Mr. Turner got himself quite a bargain." A thin smile. "This town certainly knows how to make a trade." Mark did not turn around, but she felt her hand tighten slightly around the basket handle. Caleb stopped. He did not raise his voice, did not slam the counter, did not show anger. He turned and looked directly at the woman. "My wife manages the farm's books," he said evenly. "She tutors my 3 boys every night. She saved a calf during last month's snowstorm, and because of her, we paid off the bank 3 months early." He paused. "Can you tell me what you've done today that carries that kind of value?" The question dropped like a stone into still water. No one laughed. No one added another word. The woman opened her mouth, then closed it. Her eyes flicked toward Mark, then away. The cashier lowered her head and scanned the items faster than usual. Mark stood still. Her heart pounded. Not from shame, but because for the first time in her life, someone had stood between her and contempt. Not with fists, not with shouting, but with recognition. When they stepped into the parking lot, the wind brushed softly through her hair. "You didn't have to do that," Mark said quietly. Caleb opened the truck door for her. "I know," he replied, "but I wanted to." It was not a grand declaration, just a choice. And it is in small choices like that that respect is built. In the weeks that followed, something shifted. Not suddenly, but clearly. The bank manager began shaking Caleb's hand a little longer than usual. Luke's teacher praised Ethan's essay and mentioned his remarkable progress. A neighbor brought over a basket of apples, casually remarking that "Your apple pie the other day was really good." No one apologized, but the whispers stopped. One afternoon, as Mark was recording livestock feed expenses, Caleb walked into the kitchen holding a sheet of paper. "We made more profit than expected this quarter," he said. She looked up, her eyes bright. "That means you can fix the porch before winter." Caleb looked at her a moment longer than necessary. "I can," he said slowly. "But what I want to do first is ask you something." The air seemed to pause. Mark set her pen down. "I brought you here because I needed help," Caleb began. "Now, I don't need it anymore." Her heart faltered. He continued, "I want you to stay. Not because of debt, not because of an arrangement." He took a breath. "But because I choose to." The small kitchen fell silent. The late afternoon light filtered through the window, casting a gentle, golden hue across the table. For 21 years of her life, Mark had never been asked whether she wanted to stay anywhere. Every decision had been made for her. Until now. She looked at the man standing before her, not perfect, not polished, but sincere. "Are you asking my permission?" she asked softly. Caleb nodded. "It's the only way that means anything." Mark smiled. Not a guarded smile, not a polite one, but the smile of someone being given the power to choose for the first time. "Then, I agree." There was no background music, no fireworks, just 2 people standing in a kitchen warm with the scent of toasted bread. But from that moment on, their story was no longer about rescue. It was about partnership. And the small town that once whispered began to understand something. There are values you cannot see at first glance. But when you witness them long enough, 5 years is not a very long time in a person's life. But for someone who was once signed away in a parking lot behind a bar, 5 years can be an entirely different world. Spring returned to the Midwest, gentle and full of promise. The wheat fields behind the Turner farm turned a tender green. The newly built fences stood straight, no longer riddled with gaps. The barn had been expanded with an additional wing, and on a low hill in the distance, a second, small house was being raised, for a future they no longer feared. The farm was no longer merely getting by, it was thriving. The books were balanced. The bank sent letters of congratulations instead of reminders. Neighbors stopped by, not out of curiosity but out of respect. Ethan was 19, preparing to enter college to study agriculture. He said he wanted to learn to work the land better than his father did. But whenever he looked at Mark, there was still something in his eyes that resembled gratitude. Something that did not need to be spoken. Luke, 15, played baseball for his high school team. Every time he scored, he searched the stands for the face of the woman who had once taught him how to read his first lines of text. Noah, 12, was no longer afraid of the dark. Each night he read stories to his little sister, imitating the warm voice he had once listened to. And that little sister, Clara, had been born into a house filled with laughter, not into an exchange. Mark stood on the porch one late summer afternoon, one hand resting lightly on the curve of her belly, pregnant with their second child. The wind moved through her hair, carrying the scent of dry grass and fading sunlight. Caleb walked up from the barn, his shirt damp with sweat. He looked at his wife, no longer the quiet woman in a parking lot years ago, but the pillar of their family. "You've turned this place into a kingdom," he said, half joking, half sincere. Mark smiled. "Not a kingdom," she replied. "Just a home built from doing the right thing, over and over again." Inside the living room, hanging above the fireplace, was the family portrait taken last year. Caleb stood in the center, his hand resting on Mark's shoulder. The three boys stood on either side, Clara cradled in their arms. No one in the photograph looked like they were missing anything. In the garage behind the house, the old Ford F-150 was still there, not for its material worth, but for its memory. It was kept clean and parked in the right corner. On the wall above its hood, Caleb had mounted a small metal plaque. The inscription was hand-etched, unadorned, and straightforward. "The truck that brought me everything, 2004. Mark once asked him why he kept it. Caleb answered simply, "Not to remember something bad, but to remember that one right decision can change an entire life." That evening, as the whole family gathered around a dining table longer than before, laughter spilled all there away to the porch. Ethan talked about college, Luke debated about his favorite team, Noah asked for more dessert. Mark looked around. Sometimes she still thought about that night years ago, the neon lights, the scratch of pen against paper, her father's dry voice. But the memory no longer made her heart ache. It felt more like a door that had already closed. Caleb stepped out onto the porch with her after dinner. The sky deepened into shades of violet. Fireflies flickered across the fields. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked. Mark thought for a moment. "If you're asking whether I wanted that to happen, then no," she said. "But if that day hadn't happened, I might not be standing here." Caleb squeezed her hand gently. "He thought you were worth a truck," he said. Mark looked toward the garage where the old F-150 rested quietly. "Worth isn't in what someone trades you for," she replied softly. "It's in what you build from it." The wind moved across the fields like ripples over water. Somewhere in the small town a few miles away, people might still remember the story from years ago, but they no longer told it with pity. They told it as proof that a person may be mispriced, but never permanently defined. And when night fell, the light from the Turner house glowed warmly against the vast rural darkness. No longer a house that had once forgotten how to breathe, but a place where every heartbeat was cherished. Because sometimes, the most valuable thing in life is not avoiding the wrong exchanges, but daring to turn them into the beginning of something better. Time passed without noise. There were no grand milestones to mark it, Only early mornings, shared dinners, and seasons follow one another. The Turner farm was no longer spoken of as the place where the girl was traded for a truck. People now call it the most stable farm in the region. But for Mark, the most significant change was not in reputation. It was in how she felt inside. She no longer stepped out of the house thinking she had something to prove. Not to prove she was worthy, not to prove she was capable, not to prove she was not merchandise. She simply lived. One early autumn morning, while mist still hovered lightly over the grass, Mark woke earlier than usual. She stepped onto the porch holding a warm cup of coffee in her hands. From a distance, she saw Ethan, now home from college for break, showing Luke how to repair a tractor. Noah carefully carried his little sister around a pile of hay. Caleb stood in the middle of the yard watching his children. He said, "Nothing." But his eyes carried something he had once not dared to hope for. Peace. Mark stepped down from the porch and walked toward them. Luke was the first to look up. "Mom, Ethan's doing this part wrong," he laughed. The word "mom" came so naturally that it took her a full breath to realize it. Not Miss Mark, not the helper, not the woman Dad brought home. Just Mom. No one had discussed it. There had been no official moment. It came when love had grown deep enough that it no longer needed to be named. A few weeks later, the town held its annual fall festival. For the first time, Mark was invited to speak on behalf of the farming families. She stood on a simple wooden platform looking out at the familiar faces. In the crowd were people who had once whispered, people who had once stayed silent, and people who had learned to see differently. Mark did not speak about the past. She did not mention the truck. She spoke about the land. "The soil doesn't ask where you come from," she said gently. "It only responds to how you care for it." She paused. "People are the same." There was no thunderous applause, only thoughtful silence, and then slow nods. After the ceremony, an older woman approached her. "I used to think you wouldn't last," she admitted. Mark smiled. "I used to think so too," she replied. No sarcasm, no bitterness, just truth. That evening, as the family sat on the porch, Clara ran over and placed a wildflower she had just picked into Mark's hand. "For you, Mom," she said. Mark bent down and kissed her daughter's hair, and she understood something clearly. Her value no longer rested in how others saw her, nor in Caleb's protection. It lived in the choices she made every day. To stay, to love, to refuse to let the past dictate the future. Caleb sat down beside her. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I hadn't been standing in that parking lot that day?" he asked. Mark looked toward the fields, where the sunset was painting each row of soil in gold. "Yes," she said. "And?" She thought longer this time. "I think I would have found a way to survive," she answered slowly. "But I might never have known what it feels like to be chosen." Caleb said nothing more. He simply held her hand. Behind them, the children's laughter rang out, free, clear, untouched by shadow. The Turner farm was not perfect. There would be dry seasons, unexpected expenses, exhausting days, but it had been built on something more substantial than money: respect and choice. Night gradually settled. The house lights turned on, casting a warm glow across the yard. Mark stood and looked back at the house, at her family. She was no longer the girl whose name had been signed away. She was the woman who had turned a cold transaction into a deeply human beginning. And perhaps the most profound lesson of this story is not about being rescued. It is about who you choose to become when you are given the chance. Because true worth does not need to be confirmed by anyone. It reveals itself in the way you live each day. Some stories end with a victory. Some stories close with an apology. But this story does not end that way. It continues. Because what Mark and Caleb built was not just a prosperous farm. They built a foundation, strong enough to pass on. 10 years since that night in the parking lot, the Turner farm was no longer the second name in the region. It had become the place people turned to for advice, seed loans, or to learn sustainable land management. Ethan returned from college with a degree in agriculture and a bold idea: to convert part of the land to organic farming. Caleb did not object. He listened. Mark sat between father and son during a long evening discussion, analyzing costs, profits, and risks. She did not impose. She asked questions. Have you accounted for drought season? Do you have a contingency plan if the market shifts? Ethan smiled. I learned how to ask questions from Mom. The word Mom rang out naturally, fully formed. No one remembered that Mark had once not carried the Turner name. Luke, now grown, handled the business side. He negotiated milk contracts, learning to look a man in the eye without stepping back. Noah, the boy who once feared the dark, now taught reading skills to children in town every Wednesday evening. And Clara, the girl born into love, grew up knowing the family story without secrecy. Mark did not hide the past. She told it honestly, without embellishment, without dramatizing it. Someone once thought I wasn't worth much, she told her daughter as they sat together on the porch. What did you do? Clara asked. Mark smiled. I lived in a way that made them no longer matter. The farm continued to grow. They built additional housing for seasonal workers. They invested in a new irrigation system. They funded scholarships for underprivileged students in the region. One afternoon, when Mark stepped into the garage looking for an old box of nails, she paused in front of the Ford F-150 from years ago. It was still there, clean, quiet. Time had not erased its origin, but it no longer held power. Caleb walked in behind her. I once thought about selling it, he said. Mark shook her head gently. Don't. Why? She placed her hand on the hood. It reminds us. The worst thing can become the thing that changes everything. Caleb looked at her for a long moment. You're not angry with him anymore? He asked, referring to Dale. Mark thought carefully. I don't need anger to remember, she answered. I just need not to let the past define me. News of Dale Jensen still surfaced occasionally, through old acquaintances, through scattered stories. He did not grow wealthy, he did not change much. But the story of his daughter was different. People no longer mentioned Dale when speaking of Mark. They mentioned Mark when speaking of strength. One evening at the end of the year, as the family gathered around the long dining table, Ethan raised his glass of water. To Mom, he said, because if you hadn't stayed, none of us would be here. Mark shook her head, smiling softly. No, she said, because we chose each other. The words spread through the room like a promise. Outside, snow began to fall. Light, thin. Caleb pulled his chair closer, his hand resting on his wife's shoulder. I used to think I saved you, he said quietly, just for her to hear. Mark turned to him. No, she replied. You gave me a chance. The rest, I did myself. Perhaps that was the most essential truth. No one truly saves anyone completely. We only offer each other an opportunity, and then each person must take the next step on their own. The Turner farm was not a miracle. It was the result of thousands of ordinary days lived with decency, of small decisions repeated, of choosing love instead of bitterness. And as the night slowly settled, The golden house lights spilled into the yard, and Mark stood watching her children laugh and talk. She no longer thought about value being traded. She thought about the value being passed on. Because in the end, the most precious thing in life is not how much you were once valued, but what you leave behind for those who come after you. And that is the truest legacy of all. When stories are retold, people often choose the most dramatic moment to stop. The parking lot, the signature, the confrontation with the father who returned. But if you stop there, you miss the most crucial part. Because the most beautiful part of this story is not the moment someone stood up to protect you. It is the days that followed, when no one needed protecting anymore. 20 years have passed since the summer of 2004. The Turner farm is no longer just a family business. It is part of the community. They host free classes on agricultural management. They lend equipment when neighbors are in trouble. They fund the Clara Grant scholarships for young women in the region who want to attend college. One of the scholarship recipients that year was a 17-year-old girl named Madison, a father addicted to alcohol, a mother who had left, and a house filled with arguments. When Madison came to thank Mark, she said through tears, "I don't think I deserve this." Mark looked at the girl for a long moment. That sentence was far too familiar. She placed a hand on Madison's shoulder. "You don't have to deserve your past," Mark said gently. "You only have to deserve the future you choose." Madison left with eyes still red yet brighter. Caleb stood by the doorway, having heard the entire conversation. "You know," he said when Mark turned back, "you're doing for her what I once did for you." Mark smiled. "No," she replied. "You gave me a chance. I'm just continuing it." In the corner of the garage, the old Ford F-150 from years ago was still there. No one wanted to sell it. No one wanted to drive it. It stood there as a reminder, not of hurt, but of redirection. One late autumn evening, as the sun lingered longer before setting, Ethan, now with a family of his own, brought his young son to visit. The little boy ran around the yard, curious about everything. "Grandpa, why do we keep that old truck?" he asked Caleb. Caleb looked toward Mark. She stepped closer and crouched down to the child's level. "Because that truck was once the reason I came here," she said. "You came in that truck?" Mark shook her head. "No. I came because someone chose to see me differently." The boy did not fully understand, but he nodded and ran off again. Caleb asked softly, "Do you ever think about what would have happened if I hadn't stopped that day?" Mark looked out across the fields, where the last sunlight spread like honey over the land. "I've thought about it," she said. "And?" "Maybe I would have survived. But I might never have known what it feels like to be chosen." Caleb took her hand. They were no longer young, more silver in their hair, slower steps, but the way they looked at each other was still the same as that first day in the small kitchen. Inside the house, the grandchildren's laughter echoed. Luke debated baseball strategy with Ethan. Noah read stories to the children, and his steady, warm voice. Mark stood still for a few seconds. She understood that the most remarkable thing she had ever done was not managing the farm, not saving the calf in a snowstorm, not standing tall before her father. She chose not to let betrayal define her worth. She had not turned herself into a victim, nor into someone seeking revenge. She had turned herself into a builder. And in this world, builders are the ones who shape the future. As night fell, the golden light inside the Turner house shone on as it had for years. Not dazzling, not extravagant, just warm enough that anyone looking from a distance would know someone was waiting there. Caleb wrapped his arm around Mark's shoulders. "Are you happy?" he asked, for the first time in many years. Mark did not answer immediately. She looked into the window where the reflection of generations gathered together shimmered softly. Then she said very quietly, "Happiness isn't having been traded. Happiness is knowing you are no longer for sale." The wind moved across the fields. The old truck rested in the garage. The lights remained on. And the story that once began with a cold signature had become proof that a person's true worth, it is never held in the hands of the one who signs their name. Something is fascinating about time. It does not erase what has happened. It simply places it where it belongs. 30 years have passed since the summer of 2004. The Turner farm is not only larger now, it is deeper. Deeper in the roots of its trees, deeper in the layers of soil turned through many seasons, and deeper in the memories of those who have lived there. Caleb's hair has turned almost entirely silver. His steps have slowed, but his eyes still brighten when he looks across the fields each morning. Mark is no longer the 21-year-old girl she once was. The faint lines at the corners of her eyes tell stories of sun, wind, and smiles more often than tears. One early winter afternoon, as the wind carried the scent of coming snow, Mark sat in the living room and opened the old wooden box she had kept since leaving her father's house. Inside were only a few things: a small notebook, her mother's necklace, and a sheet of paper yellowed with time. It was a copy of the transfer document for the Ford F-150. She stared at the paper for a long while. Once, it had felt like a sentence. Now it was only a memory. Caleb walked in and saw her sitting quietly. "You all right?" he asked. Mark folded the paper and placed it back into the box. "I was thinking, if I hadn't stepped into that truck with you that day, would I have ever learned to stand as confidently as I do now?" Caleb sat beside her. "I never wanted you to feel like you owed me anything," he said. Mark shook her head gently. "I don't owe you. I chose." Outside, Ethan and his son were inspecting a new irrigation system. Luke was discussing plans to expand their market into the neighboring state. Noah had just published his first book, a collection of short stories about Midwestern farm families. In that book, there was a nameless female character, someone once considered worthless, who changed an entire family. Noah never said who she was directly, but Mark knew. A week later, the town celebrated its 100th anniversary. The Turner family was chosen as the guest of honor. When Mark stepped onto the stage, applause rose, not from pity, not from curiosity, but with respect. The host announced, "Mrs. Turner has not only contributed to this region's economic growth, but also to its social development. She has proven that a person's worth does not lie in their starting point." Mark held the microphone and looked out at the crowd. She did not tell the parking lot story. She did not mention the signature. She simply said, "There were people who once believed I had little value, but they were never the ones who decided my life." She paused. "We cannot choose how others see us, but we can choose how we live afterward." A second of silence, then applause, longer this time. That evening, when the family returned home, Clara, now grown, asked her mother a question. "Have you ever wanted to completely forget what happened back there then?" Mark looked at her daughter. "No," she answered. "Why not?" "Because if I forgot, I might also forget how strong I was." Clara embraced her. "I'm proud of you." Mark smiled, but deep inside, she understood that the proudest part was not that she had endured. It was that she had not allowed pain to turn her into bitterness. Night settled. Caleb and Mark sat on the porch as they had done for decades. The yellow light from the house spilled softly across the yard. The fields stretched into a gentle darkness. "Do you think our story is over?" Caleb asked. Mark looked up at the star-filled sky. "No," she said, "because it's no longer just mine." She thought of Madison, of the scholarship girls, of the children Noah taught to read, of the families Luke advised on finances. Her story had stretched beyond the farm's boundaries, and what remained after everything was not the old truck, not the signature, not the confrontation, but influence. Good choices, repeated long enough to become a legacy. The wind moved softly beneath the porch roof. Caleb squeezed her hand. "I used to think I saved you," he said quietly. Mark rested her head on his shoulder. "No," she replied. "You simply saw me the right way. The rest, I built myself." And perhaps that is the most profound truth. We do not need someone to rewrite our past. We only need one person, at the right time, to see the value we have not yet learned to believe. The rest is how we choose to live. Some stories close with a resounding victory. Some stories end with tears finally wiped away. But this story does not end with a single moment. It ends with a truth. One late afternoon, as the sun dipped behind the golden wheat fields, Mark stood alone on the porch. The wind moved through her hair, carrying the scent of damp soil and the echo of laughter from inside. The voices of children, of grandchildren, of a family spanning generations. She no longer thought of that parking lot years ago as a wound. She thought of it as a beginning. In the garage behind the house, the old Ford F-150 still rested there, more paint-faded, tires softer than before. But it was no longer a symbol of transaction. It was a symbol of redirection. If that day Caleb had not stopped, if that day Mark had not stepped into the truck, on that day, she had chosen bitterness instead of courage. There might not be a Turner farm as it stands today. No children raised in love, no scholarships given, no families inspired. We often believe our worth lies in how others treat us. But Mark learned something deeper. Worth does not lie in someone else's signature, not in the amount they traded for you, not in a town's judgment. Worth lies in what you build afterward. In choosing to stay instead of walking away, choosing forgiveness instead of resentment, choosing love instead of closing your heart. One evening, as the entire family gathered around a table much longer than it once was, Clara, now a mother herself, turned and asked, "Mom, if you could go back to that day, would you change anything?" Mark looked around the table, the faces she loved, the lives she had touched. She smiled. "No," she said, "because if I changed one thing, I might not have all of this." A brief silence. Then she added, her voice softer, "What matters isn't what happens to you. It's what you do after it happens." Outside, warm yellow light spilled from the windows into the dark yard. If you stood far away and looked at that house, you would see nothing more than an ordinary farmhouse in rural America. But inside it is proof that a person once considered worthless can become the foundation of generations. You may never have been traded for a truck, but perhaps you have been underestimated, looked down on, told you there were not enough. This story does not ask you to forget that. It only reminds you, you do not need to wait for someone to revalue you. You can build your worth every single day, through kindness, through consistency, through how you treat others after you have been treated poorly. When night fully settled, Caleb stepped onto the porch, standing beside Mark as he had for so many years. "Are you happy?" he asked again, the same question from long ago. Mark did not look at him right away. He looked toward the fields where the stars were beginning to appear. "I am," she answered slowly. "Not because the past became different, but because I did." And perhaps that is the most actual ending of all. Not when everything becomes perfect, but when you no longer allow what once hurt you to control you. If this story touched you, even a little, hold on to this. You are not the value someone once assigned to you. You are what you choose to build afterward. Thank you for staying until the final moment of Deep Life Tales. If you believe the quietest stories sometimes carry the greatest strength, press like, share this story with someone who may need to hear it, and leave your thoughts below. And if you want to continue walking alongside stories of courage, choice, and actual human worth, subscribe to the channel. We will meet again in another story that might just be